The Democrats' plan to resist Donald Trump is endorsing the Cold War, embracing never-ending war, and praising Ronald Reagan. The Democrats chose Alyssa Slotkin, a former CIA agent, a hardcore Zionist, and someone who was endorsed by Liz Cheney to give the response to Donald Trump last night.
He believes in cozying up to dictators like Vladimir Putin and kicking our friends like the Canadians in the teeth. He sees American leadership as merely a series of real estate transactions. As a Cold War kid, I'm thankful it was Reagan and not Trump in office in the 1980s. Trump would have lost us the Cold War. And I would rather have American leadership over Chinese or Russian leadership any day of the week.
The fuck? A Cold War kid? Who is this for? I told you guys that Democrats are just Republicans with daddy issues, man. Do Democrats understand that most Reagan voters are dead now? The youngest Reagan voter is around 60 or so years old right now. The Democrats are more obsessed with upholding right-wing neocon views and promoting endless conflict than they do actually winning. Their extreme right-wing ideology is exactly why they can't oppose Trump on anything meaningful. Like the fact that he just sent billions of dollars to arms to Israel, or the fact that Donald Trump plans to wage war against free speech by locking up people who protest against the crimes of Israel. Oh wait, that's because they support that too. So what exactly is the Democrats' plan to resist Donald Trump, a person they call fascist, even though they are helping implement his fascist agenda? And Democrats are wearing pink at the State of the Union and holding up signs as a way to resist Donald Trump. The Democratic Party is completely cooked, man.
What's poppin'? My friends, my family, welcome back. I have another banger for you today. If you didn't watch the Trump State of the Union address, trust me, you did not miss a goddamn thing. Donald Trump, being an agent of the ruling class that he is, like 90% of the speech was just culture war shit. I turned that shit off. Literally the first 25 minutes, bro, was nothing but, I did this to ban trans people in sport, trans bathrooms, all these culture war shit. It was a deeply unserious display, as all State of the Unions are. And I saw that Democratic response, and this is why it's very necessary for us to organize the 80 million people who's not falling for this clown show. The people who voted for Trump who's already disappointed. The people who voted for the Democrats and they are disappointed because the Democrats are leaving such an opening because usually the pendulum just swings back and forth. The opposition side can pick off people as the ruling class inevitably disappoints the working class. But as you've seen here with that hotspot video I showed you guys, the Democratic Party is utterly and completely cooked. They are completely unoriginal. They are very lazy in a lot of ways, where they are repeating the same damn playbook, the same damn speech, the same awkward delivery. And their plan to defeat Donald Trump is to reminisce over the Reagan era. Talking about how you're a Cold War kid. And this is like the general talking points you're seeing from Democrats, where the strategy for the Democratic Party is unapologetically Reaganite and extremely anti-Russia. Listen to this.
He believes in cozying up to dictators like Vladimir Putin and kicking our friends like the Canadians in the teeth.
This is not what we should be doing. I don't even know why we fighting with Greenland. Why we fighting with Greenland? We fighting with Canada. We fighting with Mexico. Yet we in love with Putin. What is happening?
I mean, look, everybody knows this is not an abstract academic theory. Like, one of the basic ideas of foreign policy is you fight your enemies and you help your friend. Okay. Canada is our friend. Russia is our adversary. Mm-hmm. And he's got us fighting Canada and helping Russia. It's upside down.
Who is this for? So Donald Trump last election ran on creating peace in Ukraine. The Democratic Party ran on war and they lost. You guys see how the Democratic Party, they are doing everything they can. It's a coordinated effort to avoid talking about working class issues. But not only that, advocating for never-ending war and never-ending conflict. Here is Jasmine Crockett. She's my favorite Negro imperialist. If you guys haven't noticed. Because she's the new megastar of the party. She's everywhere. She doing late night shows. The white liberal class loves her because she's a black neocon. This is her response to Donald Trump after the address.
First of all, thank you for making the back of my head famous. But second of all, if we could do a sequel, if you could tell Donald Trump anything tonight, what would you tell him?
I would tell him to grow a spine and stop being Putin's hoe.
Bro, Jasmine Crockett isn't out there advocating for reparations. She's not out there advocating for the countless black homeless people where we are 40% of the homeless population. She's not advocating for the black working class. Every time I see her, it's the most laziest, partisan, culture war attacks. And she's like the biggest anti-Russian cheerleader. Stop being Putin's hoe. Because Donald Trump's want peace. In this current moment, in Trump derangement syndrome, Putin derangement syndrome, and turning the entirety of the NATO left into brainless children. Like, this is a tweet sent out by Bernie Sanders. It might as well be written by a liberal child. Like, look at the mythology that you still believe in. For 250 years, the United States has supported democracy. Sir, the first 160 years of this country, there was chattel slavery and harsh black code laws. You guys see how Western exceptionalism rots the minds of what the people who call themselves social democrats, but is this even social democrat? Like, I don't even want to shit on social democrats that much. Like, this is a straight up right wing neoliberal bullshit that comes from Bernie Sanders. For 250 years, the United States has supported democracy. Now, in the middle of a horrific war that Putin started, Trump is turning his back on Ukraine and democracy, all to the benefit of a brutal dictator in Moscow. So Ukraine, as we covered many times before, is a country that banned opposition parties. But just as sinister, or probably more sinister, is the fact that Ukraine banned the right for workers to collective bargaining rights. You know, one of the core tenets of what, as socialists, we're supposed to believe what a democracy is? Because we, as Marxists, or as people to the far left of Bernie, I don't even inherently believe that capitalism is democracy. You have the capitalists that are making decisions. The people who have to control the means of production making decisions. There's no organized democracy within the workplace where the workers can influence Walmart, for example, Amazon. That's not a true democracy. That's what anti-capitalism treats you. So we don't even believe this bullshit is even a democracy. Do you even see how far Bernie Sanders is, and people who support Bernie Sanders is, from any leftist theory? I'm trying to spare you guys. I need to spare you guys because I could go on a whole argument. We can do a whole live stream, and we have a great historian joining us, Gorilla Pod is joining us, on why capitalism is inherently undemocratic. Do you guys see how democratic socialists cover and actually do propaganda on behalf of the capitalist class? Because why do they call themselves democratic socialists in the first place? I'm not one of the bad socialists. I'm a democratic socialist. Socialism is inherently democratic. Revolution is inherently democratic. When you have the will of the proletariat that organize together and overthrow the ruling class, that's inherently democratic. So the fake CIA left, they say, oh, well, I'm a democratic socialist because they're capitalists who really don't believe that socialism is democratic. So they're like, oh, we believe in the concept of taking care of poor people, but we don't want to give workers too much power. That's why Bernie Sanders is okay with this. This is the receipt I always use. Trade unions strongly oppose new law that undermines labor rights, collective bargaining, and democracy. Do you guys see how anti-worker and anti-union the Democratic Party is? Is that they're calling a country that cracked down on collective bargaining even further than the United States. The United States, with right to work laws, they have assaulted labor and union rights. And Ukraine was like, all right, let's take that and make it even more aggressive, where we just ban the right to fucking do it altogether. So do you guys understand the absolute betrayal of socialism into the working class it is for Bernie Sanders and social democrats to believe that Ukraine is the country that has democracy? Bernie Sanders, the person who ran and advocated for single-payer health care in the United States. For 40 years, Bernie, 45 years, you have advocated for single-payer health care, and you were squashed by the capitalist class. You know who has single-payer health care? Russia, China. Russia is not a socialist country, but you're such a failure that you was not able to provide things that Putin provides his people, like paid maternity leave, paid time off, single-payer health care, free and universal higher education. These are things that Putin provides for his people that you have failed to provide for the working class for 40 years. You've been fighting for this shit for 40 years in this quote-unquote democracy, and you failed, being crushed by the capitalist class, and you think you got the nerve? Once again, I'm not betraying these countries are perfect, but I am not as arrogant enough to be an American living in the most broken fucking democracy to accuse Russia of not having a democracy, where the Russian people support Putin at around an 80% clip. A latest poll came out that showed 13% of Americans support Congress, only a 13% approval rating that Congress has. The average congressperson Sanders has around 30%. Meanwhile, they get reelected every fucking time. How is it possible for a democracy where you have deeply unpopular people who cannot lose an election? You have people who elected forever, like Nancy Pelosi, because there's no chance to ever get rid of a Nancy Pelosi. We have to wait till fucking Mitch McConnell fucking dies, damn near, for him to retire. So social democrats, wake up. The DSA left, wake up. This bullshit talking about America is a democracy. And I see my guest here. Let me wrap it up there. We have an amazing guest from the Gorilla Pod, amazing historians, geopolitical analysts. There it is, the Gorilla History podcast. And welcome back. Thank you for joining us, Henry. I appreciate you making time to join us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you, Nick. It's quite late at night here in Russia, but I'm always happy to join and hopefully provide something useful. And I also hope that my co-host of Gorilla History, Adnan Hussein, will be able to join us soon as well.
Yeah, I believe it's the first time we talked. It's great. It's great to have you back on and have you on, and especially with your perspective. I like to talk to people from all over the world. It was great to hear from a Russian perspective. And what I was covering is the ridiculous pro-war aggressive response from the Democratic Party in response to Trump. And Trump has a lot of flaws, but they have this obsession with waging war with Russia. And I would love, especially since you're in Russia, I would love to hear your perspective on why you believe the West, especially these Cold War kids, as Alyssa Slotkin called herself. We can just start off there. Why do you think there's this obsession with the NATO left, with Europe in general? Because Europe is saying even if Trump gets out of the war, we're still gonna commit troops, we commit armaments. What's up with this obsession? What's your take on that?
Well, it's a very complicated situation, as most situations are. And there's a couple of competing tendencies within the broadly conceived left that we could look at to see why are they supporting things like NATO intervention. One of those goes back to the fact that many on the liberal left, not the actual revolutionary left, but the liberal left, have this knee-jerk reaction that anytime that a conservative says anything, they're going to have this tendency to just oppose whatever is said instinctively. Now, to be fair, if a conservative says something, 9 times out of 10, your opposition to them is probably correct. However, if your opposition to them is simply a knee-jerk opposition and not an opposition that is based on actual analysis, well, that is where you begin to have some issues. The other tendency that we also see is this tendency on the more progressive, but still not revolutionary left, where they understand that there is problems within the United States, there's problems within Western capitalist countries, but they still have grown up within an ecosystem, a media ecosystem, which perpetuates hegemonic narratives that are perpetuated by the same capitalist, imperialist powers. And those narratives are very pervasive within their own mind. And so what you have is these various tendencies, some of whom believe that they're doing the right thing simply by opposing conservatives, some of whom actually do believe in these narratives that have been constructed and perpetuated by the same imperialists. And so you have them coming together in the end with an analysis that is underbaked in terms of analyzing imperialism as such.
Yeah, very, very well said. And it's great to have Professor Adnan Hussein. Hopefully I got that correct. It's great to have you guys on RBN. I appreciate you guys joining here. And once again, it's great to have you guys' expertise. I don't know how much you caught at the beginning, but I went on a rant criticizing the Democratic Party's obsession with war. And Trump is our class enemy. He is a Zionist who's obsessed with continuing genocide. But preventing World War III and preventing further conflict with Russia is undeniably a good thing, no matter where you are on the Overton window, at least where I'm concerned. So what I was asking Henry, and I would love your perspective on this as well, is why is there's this intense hatred by Europe, by their European Green parties that are now extremely pro-NATO, just because
European Green parties were always pro-NATO. All we have to do is look at who was leading the bombing of Yugoslavia, and it was the German Green Party was at the forefront of pushing for that NATO intervention. So if we're talking about Green parties today are interventionists and imperialists, of course that's true, but that was always the underlying politics there. They're green imperialists.
Yeah, very well said. What I was referencing, because I saw a story maybe about 2-3 years ago where there was the Wales Green Party that used to have opposition to NATO in their charter, and then they immediately switched. So you're 100% right. I'm sure that there was always that longstanding history. But even the few stragglers, there's absolutely no left opposition in, or quote unquote, we got to be very careful, quote unquote left in Europe opposition to NATO. So Professor Adnan, I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Well, firstly, it's just wonderful to be back on RBN and to see you again, Nick. Enjoy your show.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, this is a very interesting issue or a problem. Like, when did peace become, a dirty word, especially on the left? What happened to the peace movement, the anti-war movement that used to be an absolute pillar of the left? And the coalition of the 1960s was, workers and students fighting against the U.S. war in Vietnam, right? I mean, should be hardwired into the culture and politics of the left. And what we've been witnessing recently is not only like the corporate Democratic Party, but even some of the alternative parties and groups that are part of the liberal left, as Henry was just explaining, are so committed, and not even just that they're going along with it and they're silent, but they're actually active participants in the propaganda, in the war-making creation of a war, culture. And this is really startling and surprising. I think the one, big explanation from my perspective is the way in which the entire left, mainstream left, has kind of moved away, as a result of neoliberalism, changes in the economy, reorienting around kind of the professional and managerial class as its more fundamental base, that has gotten away from workers. The workers are not in favor of these imperialist wars. The workers are not in favor of all of their resources going to the military-industrial complex. The workers don't want to fight these wars. And so that's where the real anti-war commitment comes from. And when these so-called left parties have drifted away from really defending workers' rights and representing the interests of workers, you can see that they've been appropriated into the imperialist faction, very directly. And in fact, there always was a coalition between intellectuals and intelligentsias and war making. If you think about what was happening in the 1940s and 50s as a result of changes in the society, the introduction of total war, the need to mobilize the entire productive capacities of a whole society to fight in World War II, that they needed like these managerial kind of thinkers to be able to organize society in this way. And so a lot of people who came from academia, who came from research, they were the first people to start deploying things like big data that we now know is the greatest tool for our oppression, is the way in which everything about us is known and then manipulated and used as part of disinformation, and so on. They always use these intellectuals, for empire. Colonial knowledge. Why did the British know so much about what was going on in India? And they studied all their languages. The Orientalists, colonial forms of knowledge. And we have just an imperialist sort of way in which these professional and managerial classes are mobilized and appropriated, by the state for war. So it's shouldn't really be a mystery if you look at the deeper interests and the deeper structures of these political parties, that they're embedded in exactly the groups that have something to gain from their support for war, whether it's through information, in the information war, or whether it's their technologists who are at the forefront of developing military technologies. Because if you think about in the West, particularly in the United States, there's no economy. What do we produce here? The one thing, we had a wonderful conversation a few years ago with Noam Chomsky, and he had coined military Keynesianism. You can't understand the United States economy without understanding that it's totally involved in the military-industrial complex, and not just the weapons manufacturers, but the security apparatus, the surveillance apparatus that are all tied and connected to it. So as long as you have PMC as your base politically, then you're not going to have an anti-war politics, even if it's on the so-called left, but you're actually going to have a pro-war imperialist politics.
And if I may add, so Adnan mentioned this kind of countercultural anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s. And just to relate it to Russia, again, we have a very interesting example that I came across not that long ago. So one of my favorite bands is Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. I know, far before my time, but I am really a fan of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Crosby, Stills, Nash, Young. And I recently saw an interview that Graham Nash did. Now, for your listeners who, like me, are far too young for CSNY, but unlike me, don't, actually listen and follow what they say and do. Graham Nash and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were big members of the countercultural anti-war movement during the Vietnam era. And they were, as far as that movement went, some of the more progressive musicians, like very far left musicians, and were quite famous for that. And, lost some support for their more political statements. However, several members of the band in recent years have done that typical move where we see that once they have become successful and well established and they have comfortable lives, they drift back into the more progressive side of the Democratic Party. So I see this interview with Graham Nash where they ask him about the situation in Russia. And he says, and I'm going to quote him as close to verbatim as I can. He said something along the lines of, "I'm a pacifist to the bone, but if I had the chance, I would kill Putin with my bare hands, because it's like that old rhetorical device where people ask, if you had the opportunity to go back and kill baby Hitler, would you do it?" And of course, the answer is yes. Now, of course, I'm quoting Graham Nash here. But what do we see here in terms of the rhetorical device that's used in the narrative construction? Again, amongst somebody who would have been associated with the anti-war progressive left back in the day, we see this conflation of someone who is an opponent of American empire with Hitler. This is something that we see in many cases through history. I have a book right here, which I was the co-translator of, Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. And part of this book by the Italian philosopher Domenico Lasordo focuses on this construction of the twin pillars between Stalin and Hitler, this false conflation of the two with one another, and various ways in which this is done and the reasons why this is done. He talks about ways in which we have this conflation of them being mass murderers. We have the Hannah Arendtian vision of totalitarianism, these twin pillars of totalitarianism. Communism and fascism are both totalitarian, therefore they're the same. What we see, though, is that this is in defense of the imperial project, and this narrative is wheeled out when we have enemies of Western imperialist empire. That is when the narrative is utilized. That is when the name Hitler comes up. And so we have this same rhetorical device being used by somebody who would have been considered a member of the progressive left to once again denigrate and try to lend support for the assassination of a leader of a country that is opposed to the United States right now.
Yeah. Go ahead. This is a great conversation. Feel free to take on it.
Well, just a quick point on that, but it's not really a point. But Nick, I mean, even though Henry is probably younger, he's certainly younger than me. He's probably younger than both of us. You need to tell him this is more a Public Enemy Tupac kind of crowd than a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
Yeah, I was just riding with it. I didn't know what he was talking about, but I was just riding. I'm sure he was going to get make a good point there soon. But I was like, all right, I don't know the reference, but I'm gonna follow along with you. But yeah,
hopefully I made it understandable for you youngsters. Yes, I'm 29, but I'll call you the youngsters.
Yeah. Well, see, for me, like I grew up like on Tupac, so they got money for war, but they can't feed the poor. That was like my music theory growing up. You know what I mean? And there were so many great points that you guys had. I'm very interested in picking your guys' brains, especially about this bourgeoisie left, this professional, academic, professional, managerial class left. These are the same people who want to convince Americans that the DPRK is our enemy, that Russia is our enemy, and I still want to do DPRK Power Hour one day. I hope people understand we kill 1 million Koreans, and people like Bernie Sanders them will still they will still smear the DPRK. They will call Nicolas Maduro a tyrant for having the audacity of fighting the CIA in their country. And I want to show you guys this clip. This is what I showed earlier, how Bernie Sanders said we are a democracy. You guys see how it's very important for them to dumb down the left as much as possible. So they want the left to believe that the United States was always a democracy, that Russia is a brutal and evil dictator. Meanwhile, at the same time, we have to be supportive of Israel. I want to react to the clip because this went viral, And this clip is classic because it shows the contradiction of the Bernie left, the social democrat left, and where Bernie is against BDS, he's against any sort of boycotts and sanctions against Israel. Meanwhile, he's 100% for sanctions and boycotts against Russia.
In addition to stopping the billions of dollars in military aid that Israel gets from the United States every year, would you back calls for a cultural, sporting, and economic boycott of Israel?
I am nervous about economic boycotts of any country, to be honest with you.
You're not being honest because Bernie Sanders is supportive of Russian sanctions. And he repeats the idea that Putin is a tyrant. And this is how they project and they promote imperialism. Because the argument that Bernie is making on why we should oppose peace, let's say that everything that Bernie is saying about Russia is true. Why shouldn't we pursue peace? Because Bernie will say, don't you know that Putin is a tyrant? Don't you know Putin is an evil thug who has an oligarchy? So are you implying that's why we should go to war with them? And that's what I see from the left, what I see from the Democrat left, that's consistently promoting war. So I'm going to pass it to Annan and Henry to speak more on that. Annan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I did want to say that I don't think we have apparent differences, obviously, within the imperialist party factions. We've got a very, very ultra pro-war faction that we've been talking about, the Democrats. But when we look at even what is the critique, right, of this.
You guys see that now? I'm sorry, Professor.
Yeah.
I saw.
Yeah, we can
apparently,
see it now.
that was probably confusing. I see people. You guys didn't see the video, so I know that was probably confusing. But please finish your thought, and then I will play the video.
Sure. We were able to hear his words, but and those are enough.
Okay,
but
fair enough.
But the point, I guess, the point is that even the apparently pro-peace faction, presents its own dangers, and I think that's something it's not really about Trump versus the Democrats. It is a positive step from my perspective, from this, I'm sure, on this show, to promote peace and have negotiations and not, create enemies. There's no need for us to have all of these enemies. But what I think is happening is that there's a different theory of American imperial hegemony, where they still want to, be predominant in the world to the extent that they can, but they recognize on the right, certain factions of the right recognize that the all-out attempt at control during the neoliberal post-Cold War unipolar moment is not sustainable. It's not possible. That China is emerging and rising as a major power. They cannot be completely controlled. And so we see different tactics. One is make peace where you can to try and recruit. I don't think it's going to work, but I think it's part of their theory. If you see what Steve Bannon was writing and talking about, in the first Trump administration, was the idea that is something like John Mearsheimer's kind of view from a different vantage or perspective, or Zbigniew Brzezinski's sort of view, which is the idea that Russia is potentially recruitable as an ally in a common fight against the emergence and rise of China. The two groups that these geopolitical thinkers, or two regions that they have always seen as dangerous and a threat to American imperial hegemony, has been the Middle East and China. And this is what Samuel Huntington wrote about in his Clash of Civilizations, was the idea that you've got these differences. Russia, the Eastern Orthodox, but they're Christians. And they were always kind of in the West, but an Asian power, a European power. And there's been a fight in defining the kind of geopolitical identity and orientation of Russia. But that the Cold War was like a internal civil war of the West, and that once it was over, theoretically, you should be able to incorporate Russia as an ally, as a bulwark against these real Asian powers, Southwest Asian and East Asian powers that are the real geopolitical problem that the West has to face. And so that what we're seeing is some new thinking. Pete Hegseth and this other faction are really reorienting around how do we mobilize and galvanize for a confrontation with China. Even if we can't go into all-out war with China, we need to find ways to recruit support, to hem them in. And so the one point is make peace possibly with Russia, refocus on hemming in and containing China. And the other component is establish greater strength and power within your hemisphere as a regional power. If it's a multipolar world, then you have to focus on where you have the comparative advantage. And the United States has an imperialist advantage in the Western Hemisphere since the Monroe Doctrine, since it emerged as a major historical industrial power in the Western Hemisphere, and it dominated in that Western Hemisphere for so many, decades. What happened after World War II is it became a global power, more obviously. And now, in some ways, it's saying, the overextension, and this is actually, I think, a theory that's worth looking at, the overextension of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Now, and at this point in Ukraine, in the Middle East, for the last 20 years during the global war on terror in the Middle East, actually created the opportunity for radical social movements, left politics, for a different kind of the pink tide, in South America and Latin America. And I think there is a sense that we need to refocus and not, kind of lose our grip on the resources and in our own hemisphere. So Greenland is there, South America, and we may not be able to completely control the whole world as we thought we could and tried to in the immediate, aftermath of the Cold War, because China is too strong. We have to be defensive on limiting China and then be aggressive in our own region to prevent Russian, we've seen with Venezuela, on the sanctions that they've been under, that they've been forging positive alliances with countries like Iran, Russia, China, the whole BRICS kind of community. And that is a really huge threat that they're refocusing on. So what I would say is that what we've got are two imperialist kind of factions that are just differing on some of the strategic concerns about how to manage U.S. empire in a changing world. And there's some people who are so deluded to think that they could still continue, the neocons, who think that the only way is to leverage U.S. global military power to try and completely dominate the world. But there are others who are now recognizing that that may not be sustainable, but we still have to maximize where we have our advantages.
Yeah, Henry, go ahead. Feel free.
Yeah. Well, first I have to say, Adnan, I'm surprised when you brought up Venezuela and you said interesting alliances that they find themselves. And I'm surprised that you didn't bring up Palestine, because of course the Bolivarian Revolution has always been a friend of Palestine, and in recent years has been particularly friendly with the Palestinian people and has been particularly vociferous, even rhetorically, in defense of the Palestinian Liberation Project. But there's a couple other points that I would like to make, and I'll try to be brief with them because I know that you have surely a lot of things that you want to ask, Nick.
I'm enjoying the conversation. Feel free to cook, man.
I'm glad. So Adnan is mentioning about how the United States is analyzing the way that the world's orientation is currently and thinking, how can they make the system as favorable to themselves as they can? And trying to split Russia away from China is kind of a big point of that right now. And that's something that the Trump administration in particular is utilizing. And if you ask Russians, and I do because I live here, there's very few people that I talk to that have this rosy view of Trump in terms of Trump is a friend of the Russian people. There is a very clear analysis that Trump is doing some of the things that he is doing with the explicit intention of trying to split Russia away from China. Now, recently, Trump even said, and I will quote, "BRICS is dead," because he is trying to impose various tariffs, different sanctions on countries that are operating within the BRICS bloc. And with his view, of course, American tariffs are always 100% effective. So as soon as I announce that there's going to be tariffs, BRICS is suddenly going to be dead. Well, I can tell you that the Russian government and the Chinese government looked at that statement and both laughed at it. Obviously, BRICS is not dead. See, there you go. But I do also want to turn back a step. We were talking about sanctions. and the purpose of sanctions. Well, if you're listening to RBN and you don't listen to Guerrilla History, I recommend you going back to the show about 2 years ago at this point. We had a series, Sanctions as War. And the series is based off of the book, Sanctions as War, which is on the topic exactly as it sounds. Sanctions are war. And we looked at both from a theoretical standpoint as well as various case studies, everything from Russia to Venezuela to North Korea and China, Syria, Iraq, Iran. We look at how sanctions are designed and also how sanctions impact people within the targeted countries. We looked at the rhetoric, which is that, of course, if we put these sanctions in place, it will allow us to help change the evil regime to a regime or a government that will be more friendly for its people. Will encourage the people by the coercive force of sanctions to rise up and overthrow their oppressive governments. However, when we look at and analyze the impact of sanctions, what we see is that the governments are not impacted, the oligarchs are not impacted. It's ordinary people who are most severely impacted, particularly those of marginalized or particularly vulnerable groups, women, children, who are impacted most severely. And at a certain point, the United States government appears to go through an analysis where they realize that the sanctions regime is not going to have the intended impact of actually changing the government structure of that country, but rather it becomes more of a punitive measure to just punish the people for continuing to support a government that is opposed to the United States. So just a case study, which hasn't come out on Guerrilla History yet, but just recorded it. I know, Adnan, you missed the conversation, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it too when you hear it. Just recorded it a couple of days ago, and it'll be coming out in a few weeks. I talked with a professor who's from the Sakha Republic, which is one of the Far East republics in Russia. It's the size of India and only has about 500,000 people, but there is a large percentage of them who are indigenous, and that region accounts for 25% of the world's diamond production. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, not only are there dozens of sanctions packages that have been levied against Russia in general, but the joint stock company that operates within the Sakha Republic was targeted by sanctions directly. In terms of the United States government, looked at this company, which is part owned by the Republic, that is largely an indigenous republic, the Russian government, and some private shareholders. They targeted this company directly for sanctions. When we analyze the impact of these sanctions, who is impacted? The indigenous communities within the Sakha Republic. And surely the United States government is well aware of that. This company is well known for, of course, it has extractive and exploiting practices that it undergoes. Nobody's claiming that it's a perfect thing, but it is the lifeblood of that community in very many ways and does carry out many programs, including education and healthcare programs, in this very remote, very difficult to access, and otherwise not that well off republic in Russia. They provide a lot of these services. And of course, who's buying diamonds from them? Western consumers. So when you have Western governments levying sanctions directly against that company, you are cutting off the primary buyer of those materials and cutting off the indigenous communities who rely on that income from that joint stock company from being able to profit from it. So I'm just trying to tie a couple of these threads together just as a example, a case study. We were talking about sanctions. We have been talking about Russia. I know that we also talk about indigenous communities on RBN and on Guerrilla History, both. So I thought weaving these things together might be a useful thing for us to do.
I explained how John Bolton bragged, like as he was leaving the Trump administration, how the Trump sanctions brought Venezuela to its knees. And the State Department mentioned how the goal of sanctions is to create unrest among the people so they will overthrow the government. Why would there be unrest among the people as a result of the sanctions? Because it's the United States economically strangleholding the people, and they want the people to believe that's the result of their leadership. So by overthrowing the leadership, they can have sanction relief. This is a strategy that they use as one of the core imperialist mechanisms for regime change for decades now. That's why I love what you said, Henry, because this is a message
Well,
that we emphasize that
there's an
sanctions
obvious
are war. Go ahead.
There's an obvious case study with what you're saying, Nick, which is Cuba. Cuba's been under sanctions for 80 years at this point. If the intention was that these sanctions would cause people to rise up and overthrow their government, don't you think that would have already happened by now? Cuba has gone through numerous periods of extreme deprivation as a result of the internationally illegal blockade that the United States has imposed for 80 years. We can talk about the special period in the 90s where Soviet support for Cuba was lost because of, the Soviet Union no longer existing. And we can also talk about right now. Why is it that we have these periods of time where there is extreme deprivation in Cuba, and yet we still do not see them overthrowing the government? Well, there's two main reasons. One, the government of Cuba is an ideological project. It's a continuation of the Cuban Revolution, an ongoing revolution. And that revolutionary purpose and that revolutionary potential is still supported by the people, even in the face of the extreme deprivation that is caused by, point two, sanctions and blockades imposed by the United States government. This is not lost on the people of Cuba. I have talked to numerous people from Cuba. There is no thought that the government of Cuba themselves is responsible for the sanctions that are being imposed on them and the deprivation that come from it. Sure, some of the Cubans I talk to do have reservations about some things that the government does or criticize mismanagement of various things that the government does. However, when it comes to the final analysis, they all unanimously understand that the level of deprivation that they are facing is a direct result of the illegal blockade of the United States government for over 80 years. And that is why you don't see any concerted efforts to get rid of the revolutionary government in Cuba, despite the deprivation that the United States has carried out.
Yeah, that's a great point, because that also shows why the Russian people still largely support Putin, because Putin was very smart because he saw what the United States have done to other countries with sanctions. So he already worked to diversify and have a way to handle United States sanctions. And this mechanism that you describe with why Cubans refuse to turn on the government, because Western leaders really believe everyone is stupid. These people know what's going on. In the same way that the people of the DPRK support Kim Jong-un and their leader in North Korea, despite the sanctions, they see a leader and a family that have fought against United States imperialism, and they are defending their Jusei ideology, and their sovereignty and defending against Western aggression. They understand that is what their government is doing. They're standing with Palestine. They speaking out against the wars in the Middle East. They continue to uplift indigenous communities internationally. I saw you guys cover the DPRK, and I would actually love to get your guys' thoughts. We can start with Professor Annan, and then we go to Henry, because I love talking about North Korea. I've been learning a lot. I'm not an expert. To be clear, I'm not an expert. I'm a guy who read a lot. Then I come on, I explain stuff while I read. I talk to a lot of people about it. So I would love to get your thoughts. What do you guys think is the biggest misconception? Because whenever I go on my DPRK rants on Twitter, on YouTube, there are a lot of people like, oh, I didn't know that. There's still a lot of people who are lost in the sauce and believe that the DPRK is this authoritarian hellhole where people are starved to death. So let's just keep it simple for now. What do you guys think is the biggest misconception that people have about North Korea? Let's start with Professor Annan.
Well, actually, I was going to suggest you should ask Henry that. He's had three conversations with a good comrade of ours.
We'd love to hear it.
Go ahead, Henry.
Yes, I have a lot of conversations regarding the DPRK, some of which have been on guerrilla history. So if you want to learn about the industrial agriculture system of the DPRK, we have an episode on that specifically with Shun Shu. That's a very esoteric topic, I know, listeners, but I can tell you it's a very interesting conversation if you're interested in agriculture at all, and we probably should be. But nevertheless, in terms of biggest misconceptions, there's, I would say, two that kind of are overarching. One is that the government of the DPRK kind of sprang up out of nowhere, and is a very aggressive government. So, of course, the government of the DPRK did not spring up out of nowhere. Kim Il-sung was the most popular person across the Korean Peninsula, and I will note, across the Korean Peninsula. We're not just talking about in the DPRK. We're talking north and south. And it was well known by the United States. There's documents from the CIA that will confirm this. You can find the declassified documents that if an election were carried across the Korean Peninsula, and one was scheduled to after the end of Japanese colonization and at the end of World War II, that Kim Il-sung and the communists would be successful in that election overwhelmingly. So what did the United States do? Ensure that that election did not take place, installed a dictator on the southern part of the peninsula, enabled him to imprison and execute hundreds of thousands of communists and communist sympathizers, and then demonize the DPRK when there was the war within the Korean Peninsula. And we can get into that story some other time because, of course, the Korean War is a very long story. The second point, though, and this is another thing that is quite commonly overlooked, is that despite the fact that, yes, there is a lot of problems in North Korea, yes, there is some mismanagement that is carried out by the government of North Korea, but we also have to analyze it from two other perspectives. One, the perspective of they are placed under some of the most crippling sanctions known to humankind and have been for decades. So again, we get to that same point that I just discussed about Cuba. So I'm not going to relitigate that exact same point, but much of what I said regarding Cuba can also be applied to the DPRK in terms of the reasons for some of the depredation and lack of various resources. I mean, think if you're relying on huge amounts of chemical fertilizer coming in because you live in a mountainous area and you don't have the topsoil in order to grow things, and now all of a sudden you have massive sanctions against importing chemical fertilizers into your country, you might have a problem with growing food. You know, that's kind of a logical thing. They understand that there. And that gets me to the final point of the second point, which is that despite these problems, despite some of the legitimate concerns, the legitimate complaints that citizens of the DPRK would have about the government still is popular. That country would not be able to withstand Western sanctions and be able to continue as a sovereign nation if it did not have the support of the vast majority of the people in the country. Say what you will about what they do, say what you will in terms of why the people support the government of the DPRK, but it is obvious that the vast majority of the people in the DPRK continue to support that project. Otherwise, that project would not be able to stand up to the extreme, brutal Western sanctions regimes that have been placed upon it.
And Henry, on that thought, and I'll pass to you next, Professor Annan. But this is a video I've seen smuggled, and once again, I see a collection of evidence over the last few years that convinced me that everything I knew about North Korea growing up was absolute bullshit. So, what, like Henry said, they have mismanagement issues, but I, as an American, I am very sympathetic, and I'm actually very lenient because how exactly do you navigate Western sanctions? Is there like a historical blueprint? like Western sanctions, United States sanctions is a new phenomenon, the likes that we've never seen in human history, guys. So these countries that are going under deep United States sanctions in this new age of economic expansion for the United States, they are going through something, and Henry, I'll pass right to you. They're going through something that we've never seen any country go through before. Despite that, they provide health care to their people. And look at this video. Do you see any homeless people? They provide housing to their people. They do stuff that we don't do in the United States. Where is their Skid Row? Where's the satellite images of a Skid Row in North Korea? And this is why, as American, I'm not saying North Korea is perfect, but who the fuck am I to judge when we have millions homeless with no superpower sanctioning us? Who is sanctioning us? What's our excuse for the inability to provide for our people. But here, I know you want to chime in. I'll let you guys riff for a while. Go for free.
I'll try to be brief because surely Adnan has a lot more that he can say on the front of sanctions as they relate to the DPRK or more broadly. But I do want to bring up one thing that I forgot to mention in my last answer, but is also interesting, again, relating to Russia. If we look at relations between the DPRK and Russia, they are about as rosy now as they ever have been. So, of course, the DPRK had a long history with the Soviet Union, but then after the Soviet Union fell, there was still this hesitant, tentative relationship between the DPRK and the government of Russia. You could call them allies, but it's not exactly like they were very well integrated with one another. However, let's look at the past 3 years now. We have numerous meetings that are taking place between the leaders of each country, between Putin and between Kim. We have numerous meetings that happen almost monthly between ministerial level appointments visiting various the other countries. So we have people like the defense minister of Russia visits pretty frequently. The Minister of Finance visits fairly frequently. We have all sorts of ministers from the DPRK who also visit Russia in return. Now, why is this happening? It's a very interesting time to analyze this because, of course, as I mentioned, the DPRK has been undergoing the attempt to go past these Western sanctions for decades. And it has caused extreme depredation in the DPRK. However, they have persisted. Russia has a very different situation. Russia has, and I'm going to use a term that was used by the media quite frequently within the last 2 years, sanction-proofed itself in the years between 2014 and 2022. So when sanctions first started to come in 2014, they looked at ways in which they could strengthen the economy in a way in which if there was more sanctions that came into play, it wouldn't disrupt the economy as much as it did in 2014. And obviously, they have been extremely effective in that. So what we see at the current moment is we have a country who has been standing up to and withstanding Western sanctions for decades despite deprivation. We have a country who has essentially sanction-proofed, and again, I'm using that term from the media, sanction-proofed its economy over the preceding decade in order to be prepared for a situation that we saw unfold starting in 2022. And at this precise moment, where the sanctions come into play at an extreme level, the greatest sanctions ever known to humankind, that is the precise moment when we see these two countries coming together to an unprecedented level of cooperation and friendship. It is almost as if, surprise, surprise, being sanctioned by the West is something that can be used to unite people in opposition to Western imperialism. And I most certainly expect to see that continue for as long as there are sanctions on these countries. Another brief example, and I'm sure Adnan has a lot to say here. Iran. There has been more cooperation between Iran and Russia within the last 2.5 years than at any time since, well, the Soviet period again. The cooperation is extreme right now. In fact, there was just some ministers who went from Russia to Iran yesterday. Well, now it's after midnight, so 2 days ago, my time, 1 day ago for you. And they are looking at ways of integrating themselves economically, militarily, and diplomatically. And just on the economic front, for example, we have a credit card here in Russia that doesn't work most places because Visa and MasterCard have blocked cards in Russia from working outside of Russia. So if I have a card from MasterCard that was issued in Russia, I can still use it in Russia if it's not expired, but anywhere else in the world, it doesn't work. And similarly, any card that was issued outside of Russia by MasterCard or Visa does not work inside of Russia. We have our own card system as well called Mir, which means both world and peace in Russian. There are some countries which are friendly with Russia that this is working in, including Cuba, by the way. Iran has also recently worked on integrating the Mir system into their own country so that Mir cards may be issued in Iran, which would allow for further integration. And people who travel from Russia to Iran would be able to just use their credit cards or debit cards in Iran as if they were in Russia itself. That's just a small example, but the point is that, again, we see Iran facing remarkable and ridiculous sanctions by the West, and it's almost as if this is what is pulling these two countries together. Adnan, sorry, I talked far too much.
No, this is great. I'm greatly enjoying this. Professor Adnan.
Yeah, so many great comments you both made. A lot to catch up on here that I wanted to react to. Just back on what you were talking about originally there, Nick, about these questions. Why, is it any of our business? Firstly, okay, why is the U.S. Why should we? I know that many people may in these countries that are being sanctioned may have critiques and problems with their governments, like everywhere. Tell me a place where we've got a responsive government that routinely meets and fulfills the interests of its people, and where you find those, you find them being interfered with because, imperialism doesn't want, governments that reflect the will of the people, because that doesn't work well for the cause of exploitation and enrichment, right? So this is always going to be a question, but people try and frame this as defending, the DPRK, or defending, like during the Iraq War, Saddam Hussein, if you opposed war and U.S. intervention. I mean, you don't need to be supporting any government because it's not your business if you're not a citizen of that government. So
absolutely,
so just like cool it on that front, it seems to me, but then look at actually, the situation. Why are the people of the DPRK still, broadly speaking, supportive of their government? And why do sanctions seem very seldom to work? Look at the case of Cuba that we've already mentioned, 80 years of sanction. Well, I think one point, especially in the modern period where there have been so many usages by the United States of illegal unilateral sanctions as a kind of prime part of its policy. If you think about the last 10, 15, 20 years, with Venezuela, Iran, Iran going all the way back to since 1979, but Iraq, Syria, Libya.
Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, there's been so much use of this, but then people, they may dislike some aspects of their government. They might want something better, but they know what happens when you go through with a U.S. regime change operation. You get worse, you get chaos, you get war, you get devastation, you get absolute plundering of your national resources. And you just have to look at what's happened across the Middle East. This region has been subjected to more sanctions regimes, wars, and invasions than really any other global sort of region around the globe. And you can see what's happened. So if people look to the lessons, they may not like some aspects of their government, but they're certainly not going to play into the U.S. empire's game. People have become too wise, with the consequences of recent history to see what's happened to Iraq, what's happened to Syria, what's happened to Libya, what's happened to these countries. So I think that's, an important point here. I think also in terms of the Russia-Iran, I wanted to talk about Iran a little bit because I had a wonderful conversation with a friend and historian of Iran, David Yagoubian, on a new project, the Adnan Hussein Show. It's on YouTube. And we were talking actually about the way in which Iran isn't just some junior partner within BRICS to this axis of Russia-China, but in fact, actually, because it has gone through the experience since 1979, and then also the maximum pressure sanctions that were ramped up even to a higher level of, absolutely strangling the economy, that Iran has had to learn to develop certain kinds of self-sufficiency, of indigenous technology development, weaponry, that it has actually started exporting and teaching others. So their drones were being used, by Russia. And so it's not just that they are some sort of junior partner, but in fact, actually, other countries have started to learn from the example of these sanctioned regimes how to develop some independence. And I think this is actually going to be a very powerful kind of lesson, for the future of BRICS and for the future of the global South. But I do have questions about this gambit, under the Trump administration, the possibilities and prospects of resolving or establishing some kind of peaceful arrangement in the Russia-Ukraine situation. Is that actually going to mean that Russia will weaken its ties because it's clear that with Iran, because it's clear that Iran is being targeted by this administration? Really, it's Iran and China are the two enemies. And we may see an attack by Israel, sponsored by and greenlit by the United States. The question is where is Russia going to fall in this? Will there be solidarity with Iran? Because we see the troubling example of what happened in Syria. Because of being embroiled in the Ukraine war, Russia wasn't really able to defend its interests, and we will see whether they will be able to maintain the air base and the naval base that they have in in the coastal region of Syria. And Iran actually expressed some critique that they'd kind of been abandoned by some of their partners and allies, in the Syria situation by not defending the government. And this is a question that I actually have for both of you, and something that I actually raised in some tweets a few months ago. And then I had a discussion with BetMeet Media, another great kind of show with some really
I love those guys.
Yeah, they're really great. I had a conversation with them on my YouTube project, and I floated to them because they wrote a really great newsletter. Karim Bektash wrote a really great newsletter about, a world, where China is a major power. Is it going to be a world without conscience? And I think it's not even just a question of whether China, on the question of principles for, defending international human rights, whether they, should be intervening more and defending international law and the rights of oppressed peoples around the world. Of course, I would love them to do that, but it's also even from my perspective a strategic question. Look at the problem with Syria. If there had been, they were a partner in the Belt and Road Initiative, but because of U.S. extreme sanctions, and somebody highlighted in a comment that sanctions collapsed Syria. I mean, that's a case where it's not that the people rose up and overthrew their government, but they were, in a position where, if there was gonna be an outside proxy force that was going to, be given the green light to invade and try and topple the government, were the people at that point gonna rise up? They were so exhausted by the economic situation. And I think this is a case where maybe, China needs to be a little bit more proactive in forging these networks of countries that are sanctioned, that are outside the imperial system, to have greater solidarity and resilience to protect their own interests. Because if you strip away Syria, if you strip away Iran as the next target, what's really, going to be the strategic depth of cooperation when China faces the full frontal kind of pressure that some of these extreme right-wing figures are planning? And so I wonder if there should be more of a proactive investment in the economies to evade the full economic consequences, the destruction of these sanctions, in order, in some ways, to protect the coalition and make it more resilient and more robust to resist U.S. empire and empire of the West. So, has China missed a trick? They probably didn't think of the Syrian regime as a crucial ally, that they needed really to intervene in. And I'm not saying that they should be going around militarily intervening, but I've heard people talk about how China has a very different approach and perspective, and they don't want to use kind of interventionist sort of logic because they don't want, to be subject to this themselves. Somebody like Ben Norton, who's a very, serious commentator and is in China. I heard him talking on a show, basically trying to explain to people saying, well, look, there's a genocide going on in Palestine. I mean, isn't it in the interest of China to uphold international law and be more aggressive a little bit in insisting that the Western powers actually, fulfill their obligations. And in fact, couldn't China itself, say we're going to stop doing business with a routine violator of international law who's committing crimes against humanity and genocide? And he was trying to explain, well, they don't really want to take that policy. I think that's actually potentially a mistake, because if you don't prepare, and think of the worst case scenario is we will be targeted and we will be alone because we've waited too long to forge, the resistance that's needed. So that's a question that I just have for both of you, is how you see China's role appropriately,
I think Henry's stopping at the bits. So go ahead. I'm gonna just join this conversation between you guys.
So I mean, of course, I think that China needs to be much more vigorous in its foreign policy. And I think that that's been something that has been the case since 1970. But I want to take a step back from China for just a moment, and we can examine China's foreign policy from 1970 to now, some other time. But Adnan used the word conscience. And I think that this is a very interesting word to use and can be analyzed from two different ways. And it is going to be indicative of the importance of undertaking a robust analysis. And it's this: conscience is a double-edged sword. So on one hand, you must have a conscience in order to know how to act, when to act, where to act, and for what reason to act. That is absolutely crucial. And we could use all of these examples that Adnan is discussing in terms of, look, these nations have the potential of aiding you and aiding each other in opposition to Western imperialism. Therefore, the conscious thing to do if you are opposed to Western imperialism is to support them in their own individual defense against Western imperialism in their individual cases. But conscience can also lead you to getting sucked into a lot of things that you would not like to be. So, thinking about the case of Afghanistan in the from late 1970s through mid 1980s and the Soviet Union's involvement there. Okay, was that the conscious thing to do? Was there conscience involved with Soviet intervention in Afghanistan? Of course. Yeah, we had CIA-backed radicals who were killing people left and right and were going to be undertaking the will of Western imperialism within Afghanistan. Of course, that is the correct thing to do, is to defend the revolutionary project in Afghanistan and not allow it to fall to these radical reactionary forces. However, once you are able to analyze and see that the situation is one in which you are going to be harming yourself, and as one of the larger powers within the socialist bloc, harming yourself is harming the cause for socialism globally at that point. So once you see that you are going to be involved in something akin to the Soviet Union's Vietnam, to, lift a phrase from American foreign policy thinkers, once you see that that is the case, you need to make the conscious decision to consciously not intervene any further, because harming yourself will only further the aims of Western imperialists on a broader scale. So let's turn to today now, away from the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, ancient history, of course. Looking at China, how do they orient themselves in the geopolitical scheme of things? Of course, I personally think that they need to be much more robust in their defense of these projects that are opposed to Western imperialism. Obviously, that is the conscious thing to do. However, there has to be an analysis that takes place where they say, okay, to what extent can we consciously intervene economically, through sending arms, whatever, to these projects in order to bolster them in their defense against Western imperialism, but not to the extent where we are harming overall, to a great degree, ourselves, because at this point, we are the leading anti-imperialist power on the globe. If we do something that is going to catastrophically and irrevocably damage ourselves economically, militarily, or even just in terms of diplomatic reputation on the global stage, then you start to harm your overall project, even if you were doing the right thing at that time. So that's not to say that they shouldn't intervene. It's not to say that they should intervene in every case. It is that analysis must be done. And that's why I think that having these sorts of rigorous conversations about, is this a conflict or is this a cause that we should be involved in? How much should we be involved? And then constantly carry out analysis through that process of supporting those causes that are opposed to Western imperialism, and analyze at which point your support for it is actually harming yourself and the overall cause of anti-imperialism globally.
Very well said, man. There's so much we can discuss on this. You mentioned how Trump is spending his time escalating the conflict with China, and this is the spout that they had over the last 24 hours. I'm trying to find the hotspot video. I know Hotspot posted this clip where Pete Hegseth, he was on Fox News. Here it is. Because Trump is waging this tariff war against China now, and China has said in response that China is ready for any type of war with the United States. Now this is where things get serious, guys. Now, this is why I say Trump is, despite his efforts to pursue peace in Ukraine, this is why he's the enemy of peace movements. He is a force of the capitalist structure that will wage war on their behalf if they need to. Now, you had the Navy who projected, and they are preparing for a conflict with Russia by 2027. And I'm checking this out because I saw Hotspot posted this, and I'm glad to have you guys on when I have a chance to cover this, because here's Pete Hegseth's response to China, where he says, we're prepared. Those who long for peace must prepare for war. So let's watch the clip, because I haven't seen the clip. I saw the tweet, so I'm actually watching the clip for the first time. Let's watch the clip, and then I want to get your guys' reaction to this and what you guys think is going to happen, predictions, and what, because I'm very fearful of this. Like, this is terrifying for the global working class. I'm not just saying that as an American because America is going to get their ass whooped, because I think China's going to whoop her ass, but China's going to take a lot of damage in the process. The global working class as a whole is going to take a large amount of damage. So this is very scary. Let's watch the clip for the first time, and then I'll get your guys' reaction to it.
As the speech wrapped up last night, this was posted by the Chinese embassy.
Damn. What the hell is going on with StreamYard? Let me refresh.
I can see it for what it's worth. I don't know if I could. I don't know if other people can, but I can see it.
Let me know. Just let me know. Let me know, guys.
Quote: if war is what's up last night, this was posted by the Chinese embassy. Quote: if war is what the U.S. wants,
I'm gonna try to reload it. They can't. This has been going on for the last few streams. I think there's a glitch going on with streaming. Let me try again. Let me refresh. Hopefully, I get the clip to work. Here we go. I'm watching the chat. Hopefully, it works. I don't know why
this. The speech wrapped up last night. This was posted by the Chinese embassy. Quote: if war is what the U.S. wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. As Secretary of Defense, how do you take that?
Well, we're prepared. Those who long for peace must prepare for war. That's why we're rebuilding our military. That's why we're reestablishing deterrence and the warrior ethos, is because we live in a dangerous world with powerful ascendant countries with very different ideologies. You mentioned defense spending. They're rapidly increasing their defense spending. Modern technology. They want to supplant the United States. If we want to deter war with the Chinese or others, we have to be strong. And that president understands peace comes through strength. He also has a great relationship with that gentleman right there, too, Xi Jinping. So where we can partner, where we can cooperate to recognize that we don't want war with China. We don't seek that war. We will. And the president has sought historic peace and historic opportunities. But my job as the Secretary of Defense is to make sure we're ready. We need the defense spending, the capabilities, the weapons, and the posture in the Indo-Pacific, which is something we're very much focusing on.
China is
what is interesting is how MAGA was able to rebrand the Reaganite slogan of peace through strength. Like they have rebranded for it now. Like they're like younger right wingers who think that's a good thing. Like the peace through strength ideology is what led to the United States having constant conflict. It's an ideology that neocons adopt so we can have never-ending war. Have you guys know that MAGA has like adopted that? But anyway, Henry, Hanan, whoever want to go first, any reaction to this and the apparent incoming conflict that the United States is preparing with China? And we can wrap with this topic. We definitely got to have you guys back on again, but we can wrap with this topic. Henry or Hanan, whoever want to go first.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know that Adnan has been analyzing Pete Hegseth within his studies on the Crusading Society, and that'll be something that I'm sure Adnan will want to talk about at some length. But just briefly, if you're talking about peace through strength, if you're talking about this statement that those who long for peace must prepare for war, this is just imperialist logic. You know, you must take what we impose, and if you do not, we are going to have our way with you militarily, right? So what are we seeing is that the United States has gotten used to having the hegemonic role within the capitalist world system. It is very comfortable with that position of being the hegemon. And so what they are saying is that we have the right to impose our will on the global world system. And those who stand up to us should prepare for some sort of war, trade war, military war, whatever. China, as we all know, is a rising power economically and militarily and is challenging the United States as the hegemon. That's not to say that China will supplant the United States as the hegemon, but we are, as I'm sure all familiar with, this idea of a polycentric world or a multipolar world. There's various terms from various analysts and thinkers and scholars, but we know that that is the realm that we're moving into. The United States is not happy with this. So when it sees that people are willing to stand up to its dictates, it is willing to throw itself around. It's an empire in decay. It's an empire that understands that it will not be an empire for much longer if things continue the way that it will. And so we have to do, United States government, yes, I don't live there, but I'll speak from their perspective. We have to do what we can in order to preserve our role as the hegemon on the global scale. So as you mentioned, MAGA has essentially adopted this imperialist neocon slogan and has tried to portray it as being peaceful in some way or pacifist in some way. Trump talks quite frequently about how he stands for peace. How many of your listeners know that Trump just ordered more drone strikes and airstrikes on Somalia within the last week? I mean, show of hands, listeners, did you know that there was more airstrikes on Somalia within the last week? Bet you didn't hear that in the news. Alas, that is something that happens from the peaceful president. He also just listed Ansar Allah, popularly known as the Houthis, as an official terrorist organization within the last 3 days at this point. These are things that are happening today. We see new sanctions being placed on Venezuela today. Are these the things that a peaceful person would do, that a pacifist would do? We talked, sanctions are war. Listing a group that is governing a large area with a lot of popular support as a terrorist organization, and the sanctions that come along with that is war. Bombing people is also war. And in the case of Somalia, that is what is happening. But you don't hear about that. You hear about how if we make ourselves strong, we will not have to go to war. I'm sorry, MAGA fans, this is still imperialism.
Yeah.
The Democrats are imperialists. The Republicans are imperialists. Both of those parties are imperialist. Now, RBN listeners, you're well aware of that. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but sometimes you do have to preach to the choir. Let me turn it over to Adnan.
Absolutely, I agree. Anon, you never know when we got new watchers, because I do the same thing. You never know when we got someone new watching. So, Anon, anything else you want to add? This was a great conversation. I learned a lot. I love having these deep conversations about history and theory and imperialist action. So I definitely enjoyed this. And then any other thoughts you want to add?
Yeah, I've been enjoying it. I'll just conclude with one point, which is that I do find that there might be some ameliorative language there. These people are extremely aggressive, militaristic. Pete Hegseth represents, this muscular Christian crusading ethos. However, he did say, Trump gets along well with Xi Jinping. They know that right now this is not on, unless they're completely divorced from reality, which is always a possibility that we have to guard against. I think they know and understand that fomenting direct confrontation with China militarily in the short term is just going to be an absolute disaster. But that's what they're worried about, is as well, can they use bullying language? Can they make threats to try and gain some comparative advantage? I think Trump thinks in this way, that in terms of diplomacy, play the crazy man theory, use bluster, make threats, and then, force the other side to actually react to that. And I'm actually kind of surprised that the Chinese embassy reacted in the way that they did by announcing that. It didn't seem to me that that is something that you want to get drawn into when you sit with if you're playing cards and you sit with a really strong hand, why would you talk about that? What I mean is that if you look, for example, at DeepSeek's launch, the day after a huge $500 billion program for AI by federal support to these private companies to keep the United States as a technology leader in AI is announced, DeepSeek comes out the next day and totally undermines and causes I think it was $1 trillion or maybe $2 trillion net loss in technology stocks and valuations. The Australian, I'm forgetting exactly, it's ASPI, it's an Australian Strategic Policy Institute or something like that, has a critical technology tracker that they labeled the global race for future power. And they look at all these key areas and arenas of technology development, from defense, space, energy, environment, AI, biotech, robotics, cyber computing, advanced materials, and so on. So they do this full range of analysis of who's leading in which key technology fields. And in their most recent report, they said China's global lead extends to 37 out of 44 technologies that ASPI is now tracking. I mean, this is not even close. And if you look that, I think in the history of these trackers, 30 years ago, the United States was absolutely dominant in all of these arenas as a technology leader. In a very short period of time, China has become the global technology leader. And it's not just that, they can match or mimic, they are innovating. They are breaking new ground. Their research, is now being used, all over the world, because they're doing top class basic research as well as technology development. And so it's built on an extremely strong foundation. So, we can have these imperialists strut and flex their muscles, but I think by the same token, as materialists, let's look at actually what's going on. And we see that economically, technologically, and even increasingly in terms of soft power. China has not tried to do this, but increasingly, I think, in terms of soft power, I think I back to the Olympics in Beijing. And when I watched the opening ceremonies of that, I said, China is ready to announce itself on the world stage. They just said, we are here, we are a major power. And since that time, their advantages have only grown. So I think the United States, Even the Trump administration is not so foolish at this point to think that they could have bellicose and belligerent threats and actually back them up. They may make them. They may use this like militaristic, aggressive language, but I think it's going to be a while before they would feel even remotely prepared to confront China in a military on a military basis. So they will work and do what they can with the tariffs, with like, you know, trying to pull away Russia from China, because of course China does have some vulnerabilities. Like, it's not resource rich; it has to import an awful lot of resources. In terms of, you know, food, I believe that it does have less areas that are, you know, arable than, like, you know, maybe say, for example, the United States, and so they might, you know, need to import foods. But China, the big difference here is that China doesn't see itself versus the rest of the world. China sees itself as cooperating with the world, where it can provide value and have, you know, a positive relationship to, you know, achieve its needs, you know, that it needs in trade and so forth, which is why they're always talking about a win-win, you know, kind of form of relations with other countries. It's the United States that is trying to turn this into some kind of global competition for hegemony. That's projection from the United States because of its imperialist past. It cannot imagine and understand other major global powers not operating on the same logic of seeking total world domination.
This conversation was definitely a banger. We have to do this again here soon. Where can they find you? What projects have you guys have coming up? Anything that you want to promote before we wrap up here?
Well, I will.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say that in addition to Guerrilla History, which everybody should go follow on Twitter and follow individually, each of us on Twitter, we're active there on X or Twitter. I still call it Twitter. But in addition, I also have a new show that I've launched that has a few episodes out, including the one I referred to on Iran and the one with the BetBeat Media crew about geopolitics and global affairs. It's just called the Adnan Hussein Show. It's available on YouTube and audio as a podcast. And I think your audience would be in sympathy with a lot of the kinds of topics.
Yeah. I definitely want to check out the conversation you had with BetBeat. I miss those guys. We had them on our show a lot back in the day. It's been a while. Kareem and Peter, they do great work. So
they do.
Big shout out to BetBeat, and I'm definitely gonna check out that show. Make sure you guys check out Nan. Henry, anything you want to shout out? Any projects you have coming up?
Yeah, I'll pitch a couple of things. So first, on Guerrilla History, if listeners to RBN are not familiar with our show, we have new episodes come out every Friday. We recently have launched a new series titled African Revolutions and Decolonization. It's a planned to be about 40 parts. So it's a very, very long series that's going to be running every other Friday, interspersed with non-series episodes for the next year and a half. So do check that out. We are going to be launching episode 4 of the series on Friday. We have an introduction to the series, primer on Pan-Africanism, Mau Mau uprising case study, and this Friday will be reflections on the Mau Mau. We have the next 2 case studies will be the Egyptian Revolution and the DRC from Lumumba and also pre-Lumumba up through Kabila. We have many things planned. So if you are not subscribed to Guerrilla History wherever you get your podcasts, I highly recommend that you do that. Also, I haven't mentioned this anywhere before, but I kind of also have a side project that is going to be coming soon, probably. The person who has a desk next to mine at work is a candidate, which is like the PhD equivalent here, of history, and is a specialist in Russian history. And we always complain that there is very little in terms of English language resources that are not extremely anti-Russian or extremely cursory in their treatment of Russian history. So we kind of planned a 25-part series on Russian history from pre-Kievan Rus time up to the present. So if you want to keep up to date on whether or not that project actually comes to fruition, which it probably should. I mean, our desks are right next to each other. I'll just bring my microphone to work. You can follow me on Twitter at Huck1995. And then the last thing I will say is that listeners who are looking on YouTube probably have noticed that there's books sitting behind me. This is not my full bookshelf, but these are some books from Iskra Books, which is a volunteer-run, nonprofit publishing company, communist publishing company that I'm on the editorial board of. And so these books behind me, which I've referenced a few of in the episode, are all from Iskra Books, iskrabooks.org. You can buy the books and help support the project, or just download the PDFs for free, because we believe that if resources are not accessible, they're not revolutionary. So we make all of our resources available for free to those who are unable to buy the physical books. And I have 2 projects that I worked on coming out very shortly from Iskra. We have a translation of a French work titled Communism, the Highest Stage of Ecology, which is an agroecological history of Cuba and the Soviet Union, and also a little bit on the philosophy of science. Very fun book, coming out April 25th, so stay tuned for that. And then also a republication of the Communist Working Group, which was a fascinating group. They were a group in Denmark that was robbing banks and sending money to national liberation movements in the Third World, and in particular the PFLP in Palestine. We have their Unequal Exchange and the Prospects of Socialism, which was originally published in 1985. We have a new republication of that with a really long and really interesting new introduction and epilogue by Torkel Lausen, who is one of the leaders of that group. Just wrote it for us. So that'll also be coming out in April. So again, stay tuned to iskrabooks.org. That's ISKRA books.org.
Yeah, make sure you guys check all this out. I'm definitely going to check out the African Revolution Decolonization series. That's definitely something that's very interesting. All the work is interesting, and I'll always advocate for us having an educated, intellectual left working class. So follow people like Guerrilla History. That's what we try to provide at RBN. If you enjoy the show, make sure you guys support us on Patreon. We had Greg Stoker from the Colonial Outcast podcast join us on Friday. Jody Brar is joining us on Monday. So we still have like a lot of bangers coming up, man. This was definitely a banger of a show. I appreciate you guys for watching. Make sure you guys check out Guerrilla History, and have a great rest of your day. Peace out, y'all.